listening to Life Chat, a podcast produced by Illinois Right to Life. My name is Dr. Steve Jacobs. I'm the program director at Illinois Right to Life. And today I have the pleasure of being with Georgette Forney. Georgette, can you start by introducing yourself and sharing a bit about you?
Sure. I'm a deacon in the Anglican Church, and I have been serving as the head, the leader, the president of Anglicans for Life for over 23 years now. In addition to my work as the leader of the pro-life organization that serves the Anglican Communion worldwide, I'm also the co-founder of the Silent No More Awareness Campaign, which is a campaign to raise awareness about the impact abortion has on women, men, families. And so I wear two hats. And I also have a personal story with abortion. I had an abortion when I was a 16-year-old. So a lot of my passion and my views really come from having the personal experience with abortion. On the other end of the spectrum, though, because of the work of Anglicans for Life being kind of full service, if you will, we do a great deal of work now on end-of-life issues, recognizing that euthanasia and assisted suicide has become the equivalent of being able to abort grandma or grandpa or somebody that's facing a terminal illness. And so my concern is for the sanctity of life from the womb to natural death. And I see as our culture has lost respect for individual identity, has lost respect for the dignity of human beings just because we are human and we're made in God's image. That's what gets me out of bed and has me show up every day to stand for life, using the word of God and the truths that he reveals to us. So that's what I do.
That's wonderful. I'm so excited to drill down on the work that Anglicans for Life have done, as well as the curricula that you've designed. But I'd love to take a step back, and could you tell me, do you know your first pro-life memory? Do you remember the first thing that you thought about related to abortion?
Well, because I'm a woman who had an abortion, I never would have imagined myself being pro-life. First of all, I remember I became a Christian when I was about almost 23. And it was the first time I had started attending a church because I grew up in a great family, but we weren't a religious family of any sort. So after I was married and my husband and I started attending a church, I heard about the Sanctity of Life Sunday. And I remember the preacher preached on the evil of abortion. And I remember thinking, I wish I could crawl out of here. Like I remember feeling like everybody would know that I had had an abortion. So if you want to call it a memory, is that I had never heard of Sanctity of Life Sunday, but when I was confronted with it, given my guilt, my unresolved pain, all the issues that I wasn't dealing with about my abortion, I went home from church and started drinking that day because I was trying to numb all this stuff that was being brought up in the sermon. So if that could be theoretically my earliest memory. I would say that, if you fast forward, I went through healing when I was 34 years old. And shortly thereafter, the priest at the church asked me to consider taking this position. And I remember sharing my testimony at the church for Sanctity of Life Sunday. And I when he asked me to pray about it, I kept saying to God, I can't end abortion. Like there is no way that Georgette Forney can make abortion stop. And I remember sitting in my prayer chair and really trying to listen. And I heard clearly, I'm asking you to touch hearts. And so when I think about my favorite memory, it's the reality that our work isn't going to single-handedly stop all of this. But with every heart that the Holy Spirit touches through the work that Anglicans for Life does, that Silent No More does, we are ending it for one person. We are transforming a heart to love Jesus. And once you love Jesus, then you start to learn how to follow him more carefully and obey even when it's uncomfortable. So touching hearts is kind of where I go every morning. That's my goal.
So Georgette, one thing I found so interesting was here you were in your early 20s and you're in church and you listened on this, did you say it was Sacred Life Sunday? Sanctity of Life Sunday?
Sanctity of Life Sunday in January.
Sanctity. So here this this preacher, this person of God was sharing about abortion, and that stimulated something in you, right? And it actually took you a number of years to end up seeking out healing, even though you probably felt that pain very profoundly that day. Like you said, you ended up going back home to relax after that. But I want to hear, what are your thoughts on the fact that so many preachers say that that's the very reason they don't want to mention abortion? That they're worried that they will either upset or alienate parishioners who have had abortions?
Well, I think what would have been a good thing, and what I always encourage clergy to do, is to start any sermon. And again, now that we're dealing with assisted suicide and so forth in our culture, you could even apply this to that, is that to do almost a disclaimer that the topic, I mean, it's you've sometimes heard a disclaimer from a clergy when they're going to talk about, hey, if you had a drug addiction or an alcohol addiction, I'm going to talk about the subject. I'm not trying to condemn you, but it's time for us to talk about adultery or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So it's the same kind of thing. Folks, I'm going to talk about abortion today, or I'm going to talk about assisted suicide. And some folks in this, sanctuary have been impacted by these things. This is not to condemn you. This is not to dump guilt on you, but this is to put the topic on the table because, in all honesty, this is what Jesus did. He talked about the tough stuff. He called sins out. But he also brought the reality that it was applying to people. If you have no sins, then cast the first stone at the woman. That was my very first scripture that I ever preached on, was the reference to, for he that is without sin, go ahead and cast the stone. He knew it. He understood it. So clergy need to talk about these issues because, well, that day I heard about the evil of abortion. I did not hear about the forgiveness of Jesus related to abortion. And so that's where you do the disclaimer, and then you include the fact that, hey, for everybody that has been impacted by it, the cross is still applicable. There aren't certain, because my theory was there were certain sins that the cross didn't cover. My theology was bad, but it was based on the fact that we weren't discussing the sins. Now we're very careful to look at what sins are, and even this morning, I was doing my devotions, and I remember I was reading something, and it was about not trusting God, and it was like, what is pleasing in God's sight when we trust him. It might have been from the end of Deuteronomy, but anyway, the point being is, God tells us very clearly in his word the rights and wrongs. He makes it clear. So why wouldn't the clergy who are representing our great Savior understand that it's not just the sin that we're dealing with, but the redemption
right.
that came through. I mean, You can talk about sin because you've got the redemption, you've got, justification, sanctification, all those great words
Hmm.
that are
But
brought to us.
discussing the sin, right? But discussing the sin without the healing is what created the moment where you found yourself not seeking it out for years. I mean, how different would the story have gone if they would have had that comprehensive message and they would have offered redemption and hope and healing? Now everything works together, according to His purpose. So I'm not saying it should have been done any different, but we can learn from that. And I mean, one thing I just want to draw out, because I find this so interesting that you have this story. I've heard your story, but I didn't realize just how profound that function in it, right? So here we are, a preacher talking about something that so many are afraid to talk about, right? So many refuse to talk about for whatever reason. They claim they're worried they'll lose their tax exempt status. Doesn't matter. They have their justifications. Humans are good at those. But to think that if they wouldn't have done that Sanctity of Life Sunday, they could have robbed the pro-life movement of a fierce advocate for life for a generation, for a quarter of a century. We could have been robbed of you if they wouldn't have had the courage and the conviction to do that. Could they have done it better? Of course, but still, they stepped out in faith, right? And I'm reminded similarly of Scott Klusendorf. So he's this well-known pro-life trainer, and I always think back to his story. He saw an abortion, the footage of an abortion, and he quit his ministry and he became a pro-life speaker. And how many people has he talked? So here are these things that they say, don't do this, right? We're afraid, we're scared of our own shadow. But what are we robbing the movement of by not using what we know to be right or what we believe to be true?
Well, and you're making a fabulous point. And I think the challenge in a lot of this is our own baggage, that we're carrying in these issues, is one of the things I've come to appreciate when I'm talking with folks, and they're especially folks that are giving some level of pushback, is that there is a close connection personally. And there's some place where it's not just calling out a sinner in the pew, but it might be addressing an issue to those closer to them. And I think that in the world that we live in, with almost 50 years of abortion, there's not a lot of people that haven't had personal connection to abortion in one form or another. And I think I kind of came to this conclusion in a conversation with my dad, because, my parents didn't know about my abortion when it happened when I was 16, and they only learned about it when I went through my healing and I was 34.
Wow.
And I remember the conversation with him in the months afterward, and he was sharing that he was trying to reconcile why I thought abortion was bad, having had an abortion, because he didn't want to say that what his daughter did was bad. Right. So he was trying to be like, well, there are times when it's a necessary thing. And I kept trying to say, but Dad, it isn't. And then I kind of stepped back and I realized that his reasoning was actually out of love.
Oh, of course.
But it was very complicated, logic. It was filtered with his own grief about the loss of his grandchild, because we were in that conversation as well. So I've come to appreciate that there's always a whole lot more to a story than meets the eye. And that's where, the Lord had one thing up on all of us that none of us will ever have. And that's, he understood every person's heart. Throughout the Gospels, you hear, he knew what was in their heart. He knew their heart. He knew what they were thinking. We don't have that luxury. Hence, we have to ask more questions. We have to earn the right to listen You can earn that right through listening, through asking good questions, and through looking at that person's position based on their world life experiences. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but it does give us a whole lot more grace.
Yes.
I ran across this. There was a woman I was debating at Princeton, and it was a pro-life group that had put it all together. So we had a lot of pro-life students in the audience, and this young man just really got aggressive with the other speaker, and he kept saying, how can you justify, supporting these clinics that you manage, and how do you justify abortion? And I mean, the organizers kept saying, you've asked your question, now sit down. But he was really aggressive. I mean, just almost ready to come across the chair to her. It was a very tense moment. And she broke. She got really angry and she said, "You don't understand. My mother gave up a child through abortion so she could parent us." And she proceeded to explain this whole story about the fact that her mother had been diagnosed with the problem when this woman was like a 5-year-old and her mother was pregnant. And the doctors basically said, if you don't have an abortion, you won't survive to parent your other children.
Right.
So this woman's whole life now had to focus on justifying her mother's choice. And it was like in that moment of her explaining her story and why she does what she does, my heart broke for her because I understood that she was carrying the burden of her aborted sibling.
Yeah.
And that has always taught me to try to have grace. Now, I gotta be honest with you, it doesn't always work. There are times when you hear somebody say something or they attack you and you're human. But if you can step back and appreciate that there's more to the story, there's more to the pain, there's more to the opinion, it can often help us find grace.
Mm-hmm. And we're not, necessarily saying that that's relevant to laws or anything, but when we're talking about being on the ground level and using that bottom up approach, you have to meet everybody where they're at, and you have to treat them as humans with real heartfelt feelings and experiences. And like you said, when you consider how many, when you hear the numbers thrown around, 1 out of 3, 1 out of 4 women have had an abortion. And then, a slogan on the left is everybody knows somebody, or I'm sorry, everybody loves somebody who's had an abortion. It's the notion that it's so pervasive that everybody, or at least there's a lot of people who have that personal involvement, and they had to cope with that in that moment, right? How did they manage their love for this person and their feelings about abortion? And let's be honest, especially those of us who are loyal, our love for our loved ones trumps, opaque ideas or abstract concepts. It's just different when you get on that ground level. So I really appreciate that urging. And I think it's important for all of us to try to follow that example and understand the hearts of the people that we're talking to, so we can treat them as other, 360-degree people with full lives and full thoughts, and not just see them as this is a symbol of the pro-abortion left. Yeah. And like you said, easier said than done, but we can at least strive for it, right?
Exactly.
So Georgette, thank you for that interesting introduction and some fascinating discussion. It just comes out of the discussion, the introduction. And I mean, really, it could be a whole separate podcast, us just talking about people's personal involvement and how this plays when we have discussions about abortion, those who fight for it. So I really appreciate that perspective. Next, we will discuss the work you do and the work you've done with Anglicans for Life and Silent No More. But first, to our listeners, I want to thank you for your support of our podcast. If you have any feedback on the program or would like to recommend future guests that would appear on the show, please let us know by emailing us at info@illinoisright2life.org. So now we'll move on to, again, discussing your work. So if you wouldn't mind, can you start by sharing how you got involved with Anglicans for Life? So I know you were recommended. Were you reluctant at first? If you could kind of bring us into that moment.
Yeah, I really, because again, as a woman who had an abortion, I really frankly thought that I had by default no right I mean, that was just simply not a job that I would qualify for.
Right.
And ironically, I think that was one of the things that swayed the board to decide in my favor, is that I brought that perspective to it. I brought that reality to it. And so as I've gone forward, there are times where I almost struggle to focus on the baby, because my default is to recognize what the woman is going through, and to look at it from her perspective, while at the same time, the first time that whole process, like I tried to okay, now I'm in this role and everybody's talking about the baby. Why am I the only one talking about the woman? And I realized that there was something to be said for talking about the woman, because if we can meet her needs, we can empower her to meet her baby's needs.
Yes.
There's no way I can shortcut straight to the baby. I mean, she's the mama. She's always going to be in the way, so to speak. So, yeah. I think between my own personal experience and seeing the, being able to appreciate the feeling of the baby being a threat to my future, helps me to connect with that woman and appreciate her pain and what she's thinking. She knows it's a baby. We all knew it was a baby. I remember driving to the clinic and thinking, this is wrong, but it's legal, so it's got to be okay. So, I mean, the moral compass in us has that built in, but the threat factor is there as well. So how do we use that knowledge and as we were talking about in the previous segment, looking at where she is in this circumstance, so that we can better connect with her, help her identify her needs, her fears. So many of us just don't feel like we're ready to be moms. This wasn't part of the plan. And now you have to kind of mentally quickly make this adjustment. It's like, one moment you're a healthy individual and the next moment you've been told you have cancer or you might have cancer. It takes time to make those adjustments in your thinking process. But if no one is there to kind of help you make that adjustment, and all the people that are around you are simply saying, have an abortion. It's not a big deal. Yep. That's what friends said to me. You can have an abortion. It will make it all go away. There wasn't anybody saying there's a pregnancy center down the street you can go and talk to. There was no connection. So we have to appreciate that in many ways, the work that's being done by sidewalk counselors in front of abortion clinics is some of the most sacred work that we do, because they are focused on the woman. The sidewalk counseling advocates have really come to appreciate the need to meet the woman where she is, and how that can change it. So I love the fact that I started before we were focused on the woman. Silent No More, the awareness campaign that I'm co-founder of, has helped listen to the women's stories and understand why we choose abortion, and then help us to heal. And then we can speak the truth because we've been the consumer of the product. And we can talk about the fact that, yeah, it made our pregnancy go away, but it brought all these other problems, to the forefront. It changed the way I looked to myself, the way I felt about myself. It changed how I felt about my relationship with men and my lack of being able to trust them. So once you start kind of connecting the dots on the work that we do to help women and the pain and the issues that they're going to experience if they have the child, if they have the abortion, and really meeting her needs, there's a whole lot more there. And breaking that down is a critical goal that I'm grateful that we've brought out, that we've shined some light on, and continue to need to do even more so going forward.
So apart from, let's say, our educational efforts as a pro-life movement and our legislative efforts, right? Would you say pregnancy resource centers and sidewalk counseling, are those the two main ways in which we try to be that other voice for young women?
Absolutely. I think that it's not that we're going to be their voice, it's that we're going to meet them.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to recognize that if there's a theory that we don't have to end abortion or make it illegal. We just have to stop people from needing it or wanting it.
Right.
In other words, make the product non-relevant, irrelevant, maybe is the better word. Because what we're doing is we're actually meeting the needs of the pregnant mother. And so I think the strategies of working with the women, and this is a great place where churches, schools, different groups can really come together. Excuse me, because we all know women who are pregnant, are facing an unplanned pregnancy. And being able to interrupt the voices that say you can't do it, and the circumstances that create the doubt that a woman can sustain not only the pregnancy but caring for the child. And if we can surround her with the emotional support, the financial support, the encouragement, the celebration of what she's doing by stepping into motherhood, if we can kind of change that dynamic, it doesn't matter if abortion is legal or illegal. Nobody will go to the clinics. And if the clinic isn't being used, it will be shut down.
Right.
So there's for me, that's where it's much more of a pastoral than political approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what I like about the pro-life movement is it is fought on so many fronts, right? So I just admittedly, I came to the movement from more of the fetus's perspective, right? So I'm the when does life begins guy, right? And then my tech is more so legal, right? So some are bottom up. I was actually just talking with one of my coworkers about this before today's discussion. And other people are top down. We somebody like me, I cite what happened with school segregation and Brown v. Board, and I say if we had a huge mandate from the Supreme Court, it would just completely transform abortion like that, right, in this country. So we all have these different tacks, but I think one thing I'd love to hear from you, given not only your personal experience, but your personal experience working in the movement with women, what would you say are the actual most pressing messages or ideas that would help a young woman choose life? So for instance, what is something that if you would have heard at 16 could have tipped the scales? Or what do you think most women need to hear?
I would actually back up what we need to not tell women who are facing an unplanned pregnancy, but what we need to tell young girls, 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds, is that who they are is exactly who they were created to be, and that there is great strength in them, that there is if they need to be true to who they are, they need to get to know who they are. They need to appreciate that they don't have to compare themselves to everybody else. I think I would love to see the entire beauty care process, the magazines, the women's magazines, uh, just really stop pushing this message that somehow women are not enough just as we are. We always are seeking to be prettier, slimmer, smarter, faster, stronger. There's and the reality is that females are equipped with strength and a protective mother hen nurturing spirit. In other words, the way that God made man and woman unique, and he makes each of us unique, is really what gives us our identity and our strength, our authority, our ability to do things that we don't think we can do. It isn't if I buy this product or that product. I'll be honest with you, and this is a whole nother conversation, but in the last couple of months, I've been watching commercials, whether they're on TV or YouTube or whatever. And when you look at the way that they're packaging messages, they're really starting to try to tell you you're your own God, and that if you buy this car, it will put you in the not only the driver's seat of the car, but the driver's seat of your life. And I mean, the other day, my husband and I were watching the PGA Opening or the golf championship, and the commercials during them had us laughing because I was kind of poking at the craziness of the messages behind them. But I said,
Oh, sure.
if you believe the commercials because you don't have the Word of God as your foundation, then you're constantly thinking that if I achieve this or do this. And the reality is we need to give our young people the message that they've been equipped by God to do what comes before them, what they're in. I wish I would have had the courage to say, yes, I'm pregnant as a 16-year-old. No, it's not ideal, but I can do this. My family, those people around me will love me and help me. Instead, I saw the baby as a threat to my future instead of, okay, this wasn't part of my plan, but I can certainly step into it. I was so fearful about what people would think of me that it was the predicating factor to make a life and death decision for another human being. And as you can step back and understand those realities, when I hear of a young woman, I was just talking with a mom the other day, and her daughter was 18 when she came to her and said she was pregnant. And the daughter said, I'm not even considering abortion. I will have this baby and parent. I know it will be hard. And I said to the mom, thank you for instilling that confidence in her to make that choice. And the mom kind of blew me off. And I said, no, you don't really appreciate that somehow or another you transferred a confidence into your daughter that my mother couldn't transfer to me. Right. And I wish she could have, because I wish I would have had that. I mean, we all still struggle with that sense of confidence and that sense of esteem. And so when you ask the question, what can we do differently for our young woman? It's raise them with a sense that they can live into the realities of what life throws at them, because they're not alone. They'll be with family, they'll be with people that will help them, but they have more in them than the commercials will tell them they do.
Right. Wow, that's so powerful. And yeah, I mean, it just seems nested within a society that's more about ego and autonomy and this notion that you're your own personal Jesus. And it's and that's the hard part about teasing apart these issues, because sometimes it's not always just pro-life specific issue, but it's just a greater cultural problem, especially what we battle with, like antinatalism nowadays. And
Mhm.
but Georgette, I'd love to now shift the conversation to more general discussion
Okay.
of the state of the abortion debate and the pro-life movement in 2021. But first, to our listeners, I would like to mention that the team at Illinois Right to Life has built a comprehensive database that proves the humanity of the unborn. WhenDoesLifeBegin.org has over 200 citations to scientific, legal, pro-life, and even pro-choice sources and authorities that all affirm that a human's life begins at fertilization. Feel free to visit and share the site broadly. At a time when only 9% of young Democrats know when life begins, it is so important that we raise awareness on the humanity of the unborn. And actually, if you wouldn't mind, because we happen to use that hit, before we get into some of the issues that you think are most pressing and you love to discuss, if you wouldn't mind my asking, would you say that most abortion vulnerable women, if you really tried to interrogate them on what they thought about the status of their preborn child, do you think that they would see it as a human?
Yeah. I mean, they might not want to admit it,
Okay.
but I don't think that in anybody's heart of hearts, um, it's not so much that you're denying the reality that the baby is a human being. You're denying that that life, that human being, has priority over you or has equal standing to
Yeah,
you.
definitely. Right. For those who see it as a human, I absolutely think that's the case. I guess the reason I was wondering is, obviously we have all these polls and we have all this data suggesting that, especially those on the left, it's just, unfortunately, they've adopted the logic of Roe v. Wade, where they say it begins at viability, or many say that it begins at birth, either due to our born alive rule in federal law, or because that's just kind of convenient to have an absolute abortion stance. So would you guess that those people are actually kind of just not admitting the truth to themselves, and you feel that internally they really do understand it to be a human?
Here's the interesting way you can test your theory.
Sure.
If you put a fetal model, the 12-week fetal model, or you show images of a 6-week baby, in utero, to a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, um, and or you show them an ultrasound picture, and you say, this is your sister or your brother. They they know, they believe, they understand, especially if you line it up in
That can.
the process of development. They
Mhm.
understand it's a baby.
Absolutely.
There's some place where in the development of the human mind that we choose to ignore certain information because it doesn't feed our narrative.
Right.
And we've all done this. We've all, you tell a story and you leave out a detail because it doesn't flow with the story, or it doesn't make you look at particularly attractive in light
Right.
of the story. So we can be very subjective about the truth that we choose to acknowledge. Now, where that breaks down is when the truth is more important than your being right or wrong.
Yes.
And the truth will always be compromised when it threatens your vision, your plan. your personal goals.
Hmm.
That the truth that it was a baby, I knew it was a baby, but
Really?
that baby was a threat to, I remember thinking so clearly, who would want to marry a girl with a baby?
Oh, yeah. I'm sure there's many people who go through that calculus when
Yeah.
they're a teen.
How am I going to do college with a baby?
Right.
I've got, a illness. I have diabetes. How can I manage? There are so many things that can be used by Satan to
Mm.
undermine a woman's confidence that she can do the pregnancy, and there are people to help her.
Yeah.
So it's not black and white, but the reality is that that's why it goes back to her state of mind. Does
Mm.
she have a state of mind that says, I I don't have to compromise my principles and take the life of another human being in order to survive.
And
I
to live.
you know can I do this, or can I believe that there's enough people around me that will help me? And if you
Mm.
don't have those things, I remember there's a dear girl that I worked with when she was in college. She said to me, I haven't seen my mom in 4 years. How would I know how to make a bottle?
Mm.
How will I know how to take the baby's temperature? My mother and I haven't spoken in 4 years. Who's going to teach me how to be a mom?
Hmm.
You know? So ironically, 11 years later, we're still dear friends, and we've walked through lots of things together and ups and downs. And she ended up having that baby, and she ended up placing it for adoption because she really
Oh,
wasn't ready. But she knows that that little boy is alive and doing well, and
yeah.
all is okay. So yeah, the realities of why women have abortions are 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 really, to me, a big part of why we need to be having these conversations, especially with women, because if we can deconstruct the lies that we hear that say we can't do it,
Yep.
or the college campus that doesn't have dorms for mothers with babies. I mean, if we
Right.
can deconstruct all the obstacles, or many of the obstacles, I mean, we see the rate of pregnant teenagers going down, but we also
Mm.
see the rate of young people having abortions going down.
Right.
And part of that is because they've listened to their friends who have had it and seen how it destroyed them. So again, it goes back to, how can we equip women to not see motherhood as a negative, but a positive? How
Hmm.
do we help women understand all the help that's out there and that will be out there for them, not just for 3 months after they have the baby, but 11 years and counting?
Hmm.
For as long as you need me, I'm your friend now. We're in a relationship. We're in a friendship.
Mm.
That doesn't end.
Right. And one powerful part of your friend's story is the fact that she chose life and was able to disconnect the notion from childbirth from child rearing, right? And my understanding is at the early stages of the pro-life movement that adoption was a powerful narrative, that this was a viable solution to an unwanted pregnancy for a woman who didn't want to be a mother, or rather didn't want to raise a child. And I don't know if you've noticed this. I feel like there's a bit of an anti-adoption strain in certain pockets of the pro-life movement today. Have you been?
I understand what you're saying, and it's that they have sought to. Well, okay, so if you really want to go back, let's go back and address where the pro-life movement went wrong with the adoption story.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
In my opinion, what they would do is they would say to a girl that's 10 weeks pregnant, just give the baby up for adoption. Just place it with a family. What they didn't do was appreciate that there was a process that that woman had to go through, that young girl had to go through. She had to identify as the child's mother first.
Mm.
And they kind of skipped that step. They went for the baby, and they didn't take her into account. So the reality is that a woman has to become the parent to that child. Then along the path of pregnancy, she comes to appreciate that maybe her best parenting choice in what's best for the baby is to place that baby with another family.
Mm.
The key to that is, again, how we set up adoption. Open adoption became a big thing, but we still missed one other little step, and that's this. When a woman places her child for adoption, we all kind of think, okay, she's just going to close that door and move on forward. We didn't take into account her need to grieve, her need to process, and we don't honor that process.
Yes.
If you listen to some really good testimonies on women who have placed children for adoption, if you look at some of the Bethany Christian Adoption Agency programs, they developed programs to walk that mother and the father through the process of letting that child go and releasing that baby, grieving the loss, because that they've bonded. And so you have to put that side of the story. You need to help them complete that. Right. Instead, what you get is she has the baby and everybody shuts down about the baby. And she's supposed to just go on, but she's now a mom. She's a mom the rest of her life. He's a dad. My daughter was dating a young man in high school that had previously gotten a girl pregnant when they were in 8th grade. And so one of their first dates, Brian walked in the house, and so I gave him a big hug and I said, "I'm so proud of you." And he looked at me and he said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "I wish I would have had the courage to do what you and Beth did." And these are not real names. Right. So he was like, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "You know, Brian, you had the courage to go through the pregnancy, place the baby for adoption. And you that was a hard thing. That was a hard choice. You could have had an abortion and nobody in the whole town would have known." And he started crying and he got out his wallet and he started showing me pictures. And he said, "Mrs. Forney, thank you for asking me and talking to me about this. I'm not allowed to talk about it at home. I'm not allowed to, nobody talks about this in my family. Let me show you her pictures. She's 3 now." I mean, this was, and it helped me to understand that. And then I used to also get into conversations. I can't tell you how many people gave me rides, picking me up at the airport. And they would say, "I placed my baby for adoption and they took the baby and I never got to hold the baby." It was done in the 60s. It was a maternity home. And, the whole thing was very hush hush and nobody took that woman's feelings into consideration. So, as I've heard these stories and I've seen the reality, I've come to appreciate that the pro-life movement didn't do adoption well in their efforts to prevent abortion. And so they've kind of dropped that side of it. And ironically, Anglicans for Life has not. We're not only working on the adoption side, we're working with a gentleman. He's a specialist not only on adoption but foster care. People love to say that you only care about the baby until it's born. But the reality is the church is called to care for widows and orphans. So we take that role seriously. So we're continuing to meet the needs and equip the church to help foster families and so forth. So there's a lot there.
Man, I wish we had another few hours. But Georgette, thank you so much for joining Live Chat today. Speaking for myself and the rest of the team at Illinois Right to Life, we want to thank you for all you have done to pave the way for us to continue the work that you've done. And to our listeners and supporters, if you enjoyed today's conversation, please visit our website, illinoisrighttolife.org, and consider donating to support this podcast and the other work we do to protect life. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. See you next time.